Welcome back to Blackthornprod. In this game dev tutorial, we'll continue developing the foundations for a solid multiplayer video game using Unity and Photon 2. In the first part, we began creating the lobby system. Players can connect to an online server and create and join rooms so they can play with friends or strangers from around the world. Today, we'll see how to list the player names in this menu, as well as customize their character, and finally spawn them all together in a game scene. Before we begin though,
this video is sponsored by Xsolla. They've recently created a powerful partner networking tool. For example, you could reach out to various YouTubers, offering them a revenue share if they promote your creation and successfully get people to buy it. You don't need to contact each one personally. Your program will be listed among others, ready to be joined by a massive community from 40 plus countries and territories. This is an easy to use and flexible system with lots of control over who gets access to your program, detailed performance indicators that show you how much revenue is being driven by each influencer in your community, and cherry on the cake, Xsolla handle all legal agreements and payouts. This is basically a golden marketing opportunity. Content creators help sell your work and in return get a small share of the pie. Everyone wins. Check out the link in the description where you can register a publisher account and start using the partner network.
Alright, so let's jump right into it with step number 1, which is to list the current players that are in a room. So we went ahead and created this prefab called player item. It just has this nice little rectangular background, and inside of it, we've got a text element which will display the name of our player. We have a image element for the player avatar, and finally we've got these two arrow buttons that we'll use later on to select the character skin that we want to play with. But for now, we'll deactivate those buttons. We also created and attached to this player item prefab a brand new C# script called player item. Now inside of the room panel, we've created this game object called player listing. As the name suggests, this is the place that we're going to show the current players that are in the room. So we're going to instantiate our player items in here. However, at the moment, if we drag and drop a couple player items in the player listing game object, they all stack one on top of the other, which is the same problem that we had with the room listing in part 1 of this series. So to fix this, we'll add to our player listing game object the horizontal layout group component. This will make everything get displayed correctly. Feel free to tweak the settings of this component to make it look exactly the way you want. Okay, so our job now is to instantiate these player items for each player that is in the room. So let's open up the lobby manager script. We're going to start out by creating 3 different variables. The first one will be a list of player items called player items list that will be equal to a new list of player items. So this will be the list that will store the current player items that are in our player listing. Next off, we're going to create a public player item variable called player item prefab, which will store, as you probably guessed, the player item prefab. Finally, the last variable will be a public transform called player item parent, which will be the game object that we will parent our player items to. Let's now go ahead and make a void function called update player list. Now, like for the update room list function, it will be divided into 2 steps. The first step is to delete all the current player items and to clear the player items list. And the second step is to spawn in a player item for each player that is in the room and to add that player item to the list. Okay, so let's loop through our player items list with a for each loop. So for each player item in player items list, we'll destroy item.gameObjects. And then after this loop, we'll clear out our list by using the .clear function on our player items list. Okay, so now step 1 is complete. All the old player items have been destroyed and the list is clear. We now have a clean slate to work with. So now for step 2 in this function, let's start off by just checking that we're actually in a room. We should always be in a room when this function will get called, but it's good practice to do this check anyway, so just to be on the safe side and to avoid any unexpected bugs. So we'll just check if photon network.current room is equal to null, and if so, then we'll just return out of this function, which just means that all the code underneath this if statement will not run. Now let's create this for each loop. So this one is a little weird, but we're basically looping through the photon network.currentRoom.players. So this statement will retrieve the current players that are in a room. But instead of getting those players in a form of a basic array or list like we're used to work with, they come in the form of a key value pair, which is basically a double list, where each item has a key, so in this case an integer which represents an ID, and a value, so in this case the actual Photon player component, which is what matters to us because it's this player component that we'll use to retrieve the player's username, for example. So now in this for each loop, we will instantiate our player item prefab, and we will parent it to our player item parent game object. Let's also store this newly instantiated game object inside of a player item variable called new player item. Finally, let's add this new player item to our player items list with the .add function. And with that, our update player list function is complete. All we need to do now is call this function in the right places. So the first place where we want to call this function is when we join a room. So in our onJoinedRoom callback function, I'll call update player lists. Now let's create two new callback functions. The public override void onPlayerEnteredRoom and onPlayerLeftRoom. So like the names of these functions suggest, the onPlayerEnteredRoom function will get called automatically by Photon when a new player enters the room we are in, and the onPlayerLeftRoom will get called when a player leaves the room we are in. So in both of these callback functions, I'll call my update player list function. And that's all we need at the moment, so let's save the script and head over back to Unity. In here, let's select our lobby manager game object and drag and drop our player item prefab into this slot. And then we'll drag and drop the player listing game object into the player item parent slots. So now if you simulate another player by creating a build of the game by pressing Ctrl B or Command B if you're on a Mac, you'll see that everything is working perfectly. The number of player items represents exactly the number of players that are in the room. Great job, guys. Let's now move on with step 2, which is to display the correct username for each player. To do so, we'll start off inside the player item script. I'm going to import the Unity engine.ui namespace. Once that's done, I'll create a public text variable for the player name. Now I'm going to create a public void function called setPlayerInfo that will take in as a parameter a Photon player variable called _player. At the moment, inside of this function, we'll just set our player name.text to be equal to _player.nickname. That's all we need here. Now let's go back to our lobby manager script and come to the place where we instantiate our new player item. Right underneath that line, we'll say new player item.setPlayerInfo and we'll pass in player.value, which refers to the player value in the key value pair we're iterating through. And that's all we need to make it work. So let's save the script and go back to our game engine. Let's not forget to select our player item prefab and drag and drop the player name text into the slots. If you now test it out, you'll see that the correct usernames are getting displayed for each player item. That's really cool to see. Okay, let's tackle step 3, which is to make a few modifications to our personal player item. So basically what I mean by that is that it would be nice to differentiate our player from the others in the room by slightly changing the background color of our player item, for example. We will also want to activate the arrow buttons on our player. To do so, I'm going to open up the player item script. Let's create a private image variable called background image. Then let's make a public color variable called highlight color. Finally, we'll make two public game object variables for the two arrow buttons. So one for the left arrow and another for the right arrow. Now inside of the start function, we'll set our background image variable to be equal to the image component that is attached to this game object. Now let's make a public void function called apply local changes. So this is a function that we want to call in our lobby manager scripts only on our player item, so the one that represents our player. In here, we'll set the background image.color to be equal to the highlight color. Then underneath this, we'll just activate both of our arrow buttons by saying setActive true. Okay, with this function complete, we'll head over to our lobby manager scripts. So right underneath the place where we are setting the player info, we'll create an if statement and check if player.value is equal to photonnetwork.localPlayer. So we are basically checking if the value in the key value pair we're iterating through is the local player, in other words, our personal player. If that's the case, then we'll call the apply local changes function on our new player item. And that should do the trick. So let's save the script and jump back to Unity. Before testing it out, we need to select our player item prefab and choose a nice highlight color, as well as drag and drop both of the arrow buttons into these slots. And as expected, it's working great. We can now easily see who's our character, and the arrow buttons have now been activated. Okay, moving on with step number 4, which is all about changing our player avatar. So we want to be able to click on these arrow buttons to change the character we're going to be playing with in the game. And of course, we want this to sync across the network so that all the other players in the room can see what character we have chosen. So we've went ahead and created these 3 different character sprites, so we just need to change the sprite of our player avatar image. So let's open up our player item script. Let me just quickly warn you that the code we're about to write is a little more complex than what we have done so far. So take your time and try to understand most of it. But if you don't, that's completely fine. When you're just getting started out with a new topic like multiplayer game development, it's okay not to understand everything right away. Just copy what I'm doing and you'll learn stuff without even knowing it. And it will be clearer and clearer the more you get exposed to this kind of code. So to be able to synchronize across the network the modifications that we make to our player avatar inside of the room, we're going to be using what Photon calls custom properties. So the first step is to make this really weird looking variable. So it's exitgames.clients.photon.hashtable, and we will call this variable player properties. And we will set it equal to a new exitgames.clients.photon.hashtable. So this might seem already a bit complex, but I promise you that it's not. It's basically just Photon's version of a hash table. And for those who don't know what a hash table is, it's just like an array or a list, but instead of referring to the items with their index, we refer to the items with a name. So for example, I could set player properties name to be equal to Liam, or player properties age to be equal to 19, and so on. And to retrieve the value, we just say player properties, and then inside of square brackets, type the name of what we want to get, so in this case either name or age. Okay, so with that cleared out, we will also create a public image variable for our player avatar. And so let's also make a public sprite array called avatars that will store all 3 of our different player sprites. Now let's create a public void function called onClickLeftArrow. Of course, this is the function that will get called when we click on our left arrow button. So basically, we're going to be working with the player properties player avatar item. It's going to contain a value between 0 and 2, which will represent which character that player has chosen. So if we hit the left arrow key, we will first of all check if the player properties player avatar is equal to 0. Note that you'll have to cast this into an integer, otherwise you'll get a bug. If it is, then we will set our player avatar property to be equal to the size of the avatar's array minus 1. That way, if we have 3 elements in our array like we will, then our player avatar property will be set to 2. Else, so in any other case, then we'll just decrement our player avatar property by 1. To do so, we'll just set it equal to itself minus 1. So for example, if our player avatar property is at 2 and we hit the left arrow button, then we'll go down to 1. Okay, now we're going to create the public void onClickRightArrow function. And we'll just copy all the code from the first function and paste it in here. We'll just change the if statement to check if our property is equal to the length of the avatar's array minus 1. And if it is, then we will set our property to be equal to 0. Otherwise, so in any other case, then we'll just increment our property by 1 by setting it equal to itself plus 1. Okay, so with that done, we're now successfully modifying our player avatar property when we're pressing on the arrow buttons. But all these changes are still local. They will not get transmitted to all the other players in the room. To make this happen, at the end of our function, we will say PhotonNetwork.setPlayerCustomProperties, and in between the parentheses, we'll pass in our entire player properties hash table. This line will effectively notify all the other players in the room that a custom property has been changed on one of the players. Of course, copy this line and paste it at the end of the other function as well. Now that we have passed our property to the network, we're going to inherit from monoBehavior.punt callbacks. Then let's create the public override void on player properties changed callback function. This function will get called on every one of our player items each time a property has been modified on the network. The player who got his property modified is stored in this target player variable. Now let's quickly come back to the top of our script and let's make a player variable called player. Now if you're confused about where this player variable type comes from, it's just a pre-made Photon type that describes the different players that are in our game. So then inside of our setPlayerInfo function, we'll just set our player variable to be equal to the underscore player parameter. Like that, we have now stored the Photon player that this player item represents. Now back to our callback function, we'll check if the target player is equal to this player item's player. We're doing this check since we only want to update the player avatar image for the player who modified his avatar. If it is, then we'll call a function called updatePlayerItem and we'll pass in our target player. Let's now create that updatePlayerItem function and it will take in as a parameter a player variable called player. In here, we'll check with an if statement if player.customProperties.contains key player avatar. So we're just checking to make sure that the player has a custom property called player avatar linked to him. If he does, then we will set his player avatar.sprite to be equal to the avatars array with an index of player.customProperties of player avatar. And then we'll cast that value into an integer, otherwise we'll get a little error message. So now our player avatar will get changed on all player computers. We also want to save the avatar that we choose. So imagine we pick avatar 2 and then leave the room. When we join back the room, we still want to have avatar 2 picked. To do so, we'll just set our local player properties player avatar to be equal to the synchronized player.customProperties player avatar. But if this player doesn't have a synchronized custom property yet, then we'll just set his player properties player avatar to 0. This just makes sure that the property exists, otherwise it will cause an error message when we start clicking on the arrow buttons. Let's finally make sure to call our updatePlayer function inside of our setPlayerInfo function and we'll pass in our player parameter. This way we'll update the player avatar once at the very start when we just join a room. There is one last thing that we need to do to make it all work, and that's just to come to the place where we are creating our rooms. Let's just add another room option after our max players called broadcast props change to all, and we'll set it equal to true. This just lets Photon know that we want to be able to send out and receive other players' property changes within this room. So this might be a little confusing to you at the moment, and we did cover this quite advanced multiplayer topic relatively quickly, but this is sort of a deep dive into this topic. If you're interested in learning more about custom properties or any other topic, let me know in the comment section and we'll do our best to try and cover them. But for now, just try to reread all the code here and break it down slowly but surely. Anyways, let's save the script and head over back to Unity. Let's not forget to drag and drop our player avatar image in the slot, as well as all 3 of our different player sprites inside of the avatars array. We'll also select our left arrow button and add a onClick event to it. Drag and drop the player item script and choose the onClick left arrow function. Of course, repeat the same process for the right arrow button, but this time select the onClick right arrow function instead. So now if you test it out, you'll see that our character selection is working flawlessly and is getting beautifully synced to all players. Amazing work. The hardest part is now over, so congrats to you and let's tackle the next task. So step 5 is to be able to press a play button and bring every player that was in the room to the game scene. So we went ahead and created this new button in our room panel. So let's open up our lobby manager script and make it work. So the first thing that we want to do is to only show the play button for the master client. In other words, for the player who created the room. Of course, if the player that created the room leaves, then the first person that joined the room will get assigned the master client title and he will be able to see the play button and so on. So let's create a public GameObject variable for the play button. Then let's just create an update function and check if PhotonNetwork.isMasterClient. If that's the case, then we'll set playButton.setActive true. Else, so if we are not the master client, then we'll type playButton.setActive false. We also probably don't want to be able to play the game if we are alone in a room. We would like to have a minimum number of players before being able to play. So I will say and PhotonNetwork.currentRoom.playerCount has to be greater or equal to 2. So now we will only display the play button for the master client if we are at least 2 players in a room. Okay, let's now create the public void onClickPlayGame function. This is the function that we'll call from our onClick event on the button. In here, I'll simply say PhotonNetwork.loadLevelGame. So instead of using the classic SceneManager.loadScene function, we need to use this Photon version to load the actual game scene. Now the problem is that at the moment, the master client, so the one that will click on the play button, is the only player that will get transitioned to the game scene. All the other players in the room will remain in the lobby. So to fix this, we only need to add one line of code. So let's open up the very first script that we created in part 1 of this series, which was the connector server script. And inside this onClickConnect function, I'll say PhotonNetwork.automaticallySyncScene equals true. And there we go, that's now fixed. So let's save the script and head over back to Unity. Let's drag and drop the play button inside the slots on our lobby manager scripts. Then we'll go ahead and add a onClick event to the play button, then drag and drop the lobby manager object and select the onClickPlayGame function on the lobby scripts. We've also went ahead and created this new scene called game. So let's quickly open up the build settings under File, Build Settings, and then just drag and drop that new scene. Alright, so now once the master client presses play, you'll see that all of our other players in the room get nicely transitioned to the game world. Great! Step 6, which is our final task of the video, is to spawn inner player characters depending on which avatar we chose inside of the lobby. Alright, so inside of a folder called Resources, we've got our 3 player prefabs. Now it's really important that these player prefabs are inside of a folder called exactly Resources. One of the prerequisites of Photon is that any object that gets spawned over the network needs to come from the Resources folder. The second prerequisite is that any object that gets spawned over the network needs to have a Photon view component attached to it. So that's exactly what we did. Each one of our prefabs has this Photon view on it. Okay, so remember that any object that gets instantiated over the network needs to come from the Resources folder and needs a Photon view component on it. We also created a bunch of empty game objects that we scattered around our game scene that will act as our spawn points. So now let's create a new empty game object called Player Spawner. Once that's been created, we'll create and add to it a brand new C# script, also called Player Spawner. Okay, so in here, let's start off by importing the photon.pun namespace. Now we'll make a public GameObject array called player prefabs. They'll store our 3 different player prefabs. Next, we'll have a public transform array called spawn points that will contain all of our different spawn points. Now inside of the start function, we'll begin by generating a random number. So I'm going to create an integer variable called random number that will be equal to a random number between 0 and spawn points.length. Then underneath this, I'll create a transform variable called spawn points that will be equal to the spawn points array with an index of random number. We have now gotten a random spawn point from our array. Let's now store in a GameObject variable called player_to_spawn the correct player character that we need to spawn for this player. So I'll use my player prefabs array, and for the index we will of course use our custom property. So to fetch it, we just need to say PhotonNetwork.localPlayer.customProperties of player avatar, and that's it. Let's now actually spawn in our player character. To do so, I'll use the PhotonNetwork.instantiate function. This function is pretty much the same as the classic instantiate function. The only difference is that with this Photon version, the object that we spawn will also appear on all other players' computers as well, which is of course what we want. The first parameter we need to pass in is the name of the object in the resources folder that we want to spawn. So I'll use my player_to_spawn variable .name. Then the second argument is at what position do we want to spawn them at. So I will of course use my spawn point variable .position. And lastly, we need to specify a rotation. And so we will type quaternion.identity, which just means no rotation. And that's all we need, so let's save the script and head over back to Unity one last time. Let's drag and drop all 3 of our player prefabs into this array, and then all of our spawn points into the spawn points array. And there we go, our lobby is now completely finished. We can connect to a server, create, join, and list existing rooms. We can view the players that are in a room, change our player avatar, and even enter the game world and spawn in the correct player. Hopefully, you've enjoyed this mini 2-part series on the creation of a multiplayer lobby system in Unity. From here, if you wish to deepen your knowledge and understanding of multiplayer game creation, perhaps watch this video. Or even better, we have a full beginner course on Udemy where you'll create an entire multiplayer game from A to Z. Thanks so much for watching, subscribe and stay tuned.